Hello, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Don Arleth, and you're watching World Talks here on TVP World. A fragile ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran has still left the Strait of Hormuz largely closed, with just a handful of ships passing through earlier today. Iran says the ceasefire must include Israel and its assault on Lebanon, while the U.S. says that wasn't part of the deal. Talks between the U.S. and Iran will take place on Saturday in Pakistan. Meanwhile, Benjamin Netanyahu has said Israel will begin negotiations with Lebanon with the goal of disarming Hezbollah. Now, joining me to discuss this and the fragile ceasefire is Richard Giragosian, founding director at the Regional Studies Center. Richard, great to see you, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Now, let's go ahead and start off with, why exactly did Israel attack Lebanon with such force when there was supposed to be a ceasefire? The Hezbollah reason doesn't really quite seem sufficient because they had actually stopped firing on Israel as a part of the ceasefire. So what are your thoughts on this whole kerfuffle, if you will?
Well, I think there are two main reasons driving this. First of all, I do think the Israeli attacks and partial incursion into Lebanese territory is a demonstration that even the war against Iran, as well as the targeting of Lebanon, are being driven by an Israeli strategic timetable, an Israeli agenda. Second, what we also see, the Lebanese people, yet again, are suffering. And at the same time, we do have one of the more stable governments in place in Lebanon in years. I don't think there's been enough time and patience for the Lebanese government to fully tackle their own internal problem. Hezbollah is as much a threat to the Lebanese state as it is to Israel. But I do think the Israeli actions only contribute to a further dangerous escalation.
Yes, it also seems that this fragile ceasefire could be in the hands of Israel rather than the United States. Tell me about the challenges that Lebanon faces trying to disarm Hezbollah. How realistic is that? And we know that Israel will be relentless in its demands that it do so. So what are the chances, again, of this becoming a reality?
Well, you reveal the ultimate paradox. On the one hand, the Lebanese state, the Lebanese armed forces, are not yet fully capable of restoring central authority and control over its territorial integrity, and has been unable as yet to fully counter the threat from Hezbollah. At the same time, however, Israeli actions make the Lebanese capacity weaker, not stronger, in tackling Hezbollah. But I also think there's an Israeli domestic context here, where for Netanyahu and Israel, the American deal, the so-called ceasefire with Iran, is not the victory Netanyahu was hoping for. And in a domestic political context, the attacks against Lebanon are as much about politics in Israel as they are about Hezbollah.
Well, let's talk about Iran. President Trump says that they have achieved their military objectives. They've decimated the armed forces. They've hit thousands, hundreds or thousands of targets. But we know that their political goals haven't been achieved. They haven't recovered the 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. And they have a bigger problem, and that's the Strait of Hormuz. So what part of this went well for the Israelis, at least, militarily, perhaps? And where does that leave us moving forward if Israel isn't, satisfied with the outcome thus far?
Well, a couple of observations are in order. First of all, the American end state objectives remain incoherent, remain dangerously undefined. And fortunately, according to the Trump administration, the campaign objectives changes from day to day, from regime change to removing the uranium to countering the ballistic missile threat, for example. But this is also a reflection of the lack of diplomatic professionalism by the Americans. The three negotiators now engaged from the American side, the presidential son-in-law, the special envoy, Witkoff, and the vice president. None of these people have any real diplomatic negotiating experience. Nevertheless, what we do see in terms of the broader context is a ceasefire requires a degree of political will that seems to be questionable here. Moreover, a ceasefire must be just that, ceasing fire. And there is blame on the Iranians for their retaliation targeting the Gulf states, unprovoked attacks against the Gulf states. This is a retaliation that is its own escalation. So going forward, as welcome as the ceasefire is, I'm not sure there's a convergence of interest between Israel, the U.S., and Iran to end the war.
Well, in terms of Iran and the death that's been unleashed by the U.S. and Israel on the leadership there, is it possible to say that they are in full control, at least the leadership that remains or the leadership that has taken its place, that they have command and control over all sectors of Iran? You mentioned there's partly to blame here for these attacks even after the ceasefire was announced. Do the Iranians have full control over all of their forces?
Well, I would say no, especially militarily, because what we see in the Iranian military response, the retaliation, is a number of decentralized authorities. The response has been much less a centralized order or directive issued from Tehran and more a pattern of retaliation from decentralized local commanders. This shows a breakdown in command authority, but also more distressing. As the decapitation strategy unfolded, it may lead to a worse scenario where the most hardline elements of the Revolutionary Guard B team, the junior varsity, those who survived, may be even more entrenched, even more committed to all or nothing. And that is leading to one conclusion, that there is no conclusion. This is very much a dynamic process.
It is, and I imagine for Donald Trump right now and the global economy, getting those straits open has to be the absolute priority. I think the nuclear materials and things like that are also important, but I think they're secondary at this point. If Trump is not able to get that strait open and Israel is let's say, becoming a problem, blocking this possibility. Is it possible we're going to see a rift between Netanyahu and Trump on this very issue?
Well, on the one hand, we see a rift between the U.S. president and every world leader, almost. So, yes, that could be expected, especially as the interests of Israel and the U.S. diverge. But a second important point, on the other hand, is even if the Strait of Hormuz opens tomorrow, that is not going to return to a status quo. In other words, what we see is dangerous instability, unreliability, and unpredictability, where for tanker traffic or even the fertilizer products coming out of the Gulf states, natural gas as much as oil, there's going to be much more trepidation, much less confidence that once reopened, the Strait of Hormuz will stay reopened. And finally, this American off-the-cuff comment about perhaps a joint toll structure charging transit fees through the Strait of Hormuz raises a number of other questions that remain without answers.
Yes, actually, that's a great point that you raise. You know, the United States and the U.S. Navy has, since its inception, been dedicated to the freedom of navigation. And this joint toll system seems to completely upend that. How do you think that's being taken by the Navy leadership in the United States that Donald Trump would even throw something like this out, because this has global implications that can repeat themselves in other choke points in the world.
Well, yes. In other words, this is yet another sign of the lack of planning or strategic preparation, even going into the late February initiation of the war. But I really think it's the Gulf states that are directly impacted almost in terms of collateral damage, with their energy facilities directly targeted by Iran. There is a degree of, I would say, seismic change where we see a disruption to global energy and supply chains comparable to the COVID onset, which was devastating for many areas of everything from air travel to global commerce. And what this means looking after the month of a war against Iran is the situation is worse now than it was the day before the war started.
Yeah, big paradox there. Last question before we run out of time here. Mark Rutte went to Washington to meet with Trump and Rubio and Hegseth. What do you think NATO's role in this should be? Obviously, Europe is affected by the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. They don't want to get involved militarily. Is there a role for Europe, for NATO members to play to try and figure this one out, or at least help figure this one out?
Well, there's a role for both the European Union as well as the NATO alliance, but it's not as a cheerleader for President Trump. And there is a new interesting difference or divide between the Secretary General of NATO and the alliance itself. It is a defensive alliance, more committed to collective security and not necessarily to backing American adventures, especially in the Middle East. So I do think the EU and NATO have a role to play in distancing themselves from the rather reckless pursuit of the American agenda here.
Well, this wasn't in the campaign platform, but here we are, another adventure in the Middle East. Richard Giragosian, founding director at the Regional Studies Center. Thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.